Empires do not always die when enemies become stronger. Often, they die when their symbols remain magnificent but their capacity has already rotted away. The fall of Constantinople in AD 1453 is remembered as the destruction of a city. But in truth, it was the verdict on a much larger contest, whether ancient prestige or frontier adaptability would rule the hinge of Europe and Asia. To understand why Constantinople fell, the gaze must move backward before the cannons, before Mehmed II, before the final breach in the Theodosian walls. The true beginning lies in a regional collapse so vast and so prolonged that it created one of history's most fertile power vacuums. Byzantium had once been the supreme strategist of survival, enduring for centuries through diplomacy, fortifications, religious authority, and an almost unmatched talent for turning stronger enemies against one another. But endurance can become its own trap. A state that survives one century by improvisation may discover in the next that improvisation has replaced renewal. By the late medieval period, the Byzantine Empire was no longer the coherent imperial machine that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean. It was a wounded civilization defending memory with shrinking resources. Internal civil wars consumed energy that should have been used for reform. Fiscal exhaustion undermined military resilience. Provincial authority weakened. But the greatest humiliation came in AD 1204, when the Fourth Crusade, launched in the name of Christendom, shattered Constantinople itself. That catastrophe did more than seize a city. It broke the aura of invincibility, fragmented imperial authority, and convinced every ambitious force in the region that the old Roman order could be violated. The empire was restored in form later, but never in full substance. That distinction matters. History is crowded with states that continue to exist after their strategic center of gravity has already been lost. Byzantium after AD 1204 was still alive, but it was no longer commanding the same political reality. Its authority had become negotiable. Its frontiers became porous. Its rivals became bolder. Its allies became less reliable. But Byzantine decline alone did not create the Ottomans. The other half of the story unfolded in Anatolia, the true hinge of the age. That peninsula was not merely a map space between Europe and Asia. It was the corridor through which armies, merchants, refugees, faiths, and imperial ambitions collided. Whoever could dominate northwestern Anatolia would stand near the crossing points into the Balkans, near the maritime arteries linking the Black Sea and Mediterranean, and near the pressure lines of both Christian and Muslim political worlds. Such geography does not guarantee greatness. But it offers extraordinary rewards to the polity most capable of exploiting disorder. After the Mongol victory over the Seljuks at Köz Dag in AD 1243, Anatolia entered precisely such a condition of disorder. Seljuk authority weakened under Mongol supremacy. Old certainties dissolved. Beyliks proliferated. Loyalties became fluid. Warrior bands, displaced peoples, and mercenary networks drifted through a landscape where no single power could impose a stable and universal order. This was not chaos in the simple sense. It was a competitive frontier ecology. In such worlds, legitimacy is not inherited securely from the distant past. It is earned through immediate usefulness. Protection, plunder, arbitration, land, and advancement become the currencies of political growth. A ruler who could attract fighters, negotiate alliances, reward followers, and settle populations possessed an advantage more meaningful than ancient pedigree. The frontier, therefore, was not merely a line of conflict between Islam and Christendom. It was a recruitment market, a laboratory of state formation, and a proving ground for ambitious dynasties. This is where the Ottomans emerged, not as a destined empire descending from prophecy, but as one contender among many. Their early success was not inevitable. It rested on a rarer talent, adaptability. They were close enough to Byzantine weakness to exploit it, yet small enough to remain flexible. They had not yet calcified into an aristocracy too rigid to innovate. They could raid, negotiate, absorb, and settle with a speed larger powers often envied but could not match. Osman I, the founder around whom later dynastic myth would gather, matters not simply because he began a lineage, but because he embodied a strategic type. He operated in a world where power belonged to those who could turn fluidity into loyalty. Frontier rulers did not command obedience as unquestioned sovereigns. They had to persuade armed men that service under their banner offered greater prospects than service elsewhere. That required victory, yes, but also distribution. Land, spoils, marriages, and status formed the social glue of expansion. Here lies an enduring truth of political history: military momentum can create a coalition, but only incorporation can preserve it. Many frontier leaders could win raids. Far fewer could build a durable polity from the profits of violence. The early Ottomans gradually proved capable of doing precisely that. Orhan, who followed Osman, is crucial because the Ottoman project under his rule became less improvisational and more institutional. The capture of Bursa in AD 1326 was a watershed not simply because a city changed hands, but because a state changed character. Bursa became an administrative center, a fiscal hub, a mint, and a court. Power began to leave the exclusively personal realm of tribal followings and enter the routinized sphere of governance. The significance of this transition cannot be overstated. A raiding confederation can expand rapidly, but it is vulnerable to fragmentation the moment spoils diminish or charismatic leadership vanishes. A city-based administration, by contrast, can tax, archive, adjudicate, recruit, and remember. It can transform conquest into permanence. That is the invisible architecture of empire. The Ottomans were learning, earlier than many rivals, that victory on horseback means little unless fixed in law, revenue, and institutional habit. This pattern would define their ascent. They did not merely defeat opponents. They absorbed them. They recruited local elites, used marriages to stabilize relations, and employed tribute or vassalage where direct annexation was not yet wise. Their approach in the Balkans especially revealed a strategic flexibility that many contemporaries underestimated. Christian principalities fragmented by dynastic quarrels often found themselves bargaining with Ottoman rulers against neighboring rivals. Princes became clients before they became subjects. This was not accidental opportunism alone. It was a disciplined reading of human weakness. Divided elites frequently fear nearby rivals more than distant structural threats. Therefore, they cooperate in the short term with the very power that will later dominate them. The Ottomans repeatedly exploited this pattern. The Byzantine Empire itself, trapped in civil disputes, invited Ottoman intervention into imperial politics. Balkan rulers pursued local calculations over collective security. Latin Christendom recognized the Ottoman danger intermittently, but rarely with sustained strategic coherence. The result was devastating. Every fragmented response gave the Ottomans more intelligence, more legitimacy, more hostages, more allies, and more familiarity with the terrain of their enemies. Murad I advanced this logic with extraordinary effect. Under his reign, Ottoman expansion in the Balkans became more durable, more systematic, and more dangerous. The conquest of Gallipoli in AD 1354 was the geopolitical breakthrough. An Anatolian frontier power now possessed a firm bridge into Europe. This altered the entire equation. The Ottomans were no longer raiders crossing opportunistically. They were now a transcontinental force capable of sustaining campaigns on European soil. The response from Europe should have been immediate and coordinated. But the age was not structured for disciplined unity. Dynastic competition, local feuds, papal politics, and conflicting priorities prevented the formation of a durable anti-Ottoman system. Therefore, what should have been treated as an existential breach was managed as a recurring regional inconvenience. Such misjudgment is a recurring crime in history. Threats become most dangerous when established powers insist on interpreting new realities through old assumptions. Rivals often still saw the Ottomans as one more Turkish principality, not as a rapidly institutionalizing empire. That conceptual delay bought the Ottomans time, and time in state formation is often more valuable than battlefield brilliance. During this era, another great innovation sharpened Ottoman power: the gradual creation of a central military administrative elite whose loyalty ran to the Sultan rather than to tribal kinship. The Janissary system and the Devshirme, later fully developed, embodied one of the empire's defining paradoxes. Conquered populations could become sources of imperial cohesion. Human material drawn from beyond the old tribal core could be converted into disciplined service. This was strategically revolutionary. Many rising states are eventually crippled because the ruling dynasty remains hostage to the aristocratic networks that first elevated it. The Ottomans, by contrast, increasingly built institutions that diluted the monopoly of hereditary warrior clans. They did not abolish older power structures overnight, but they created alternatives. Therefore, the center gained leverage over the periphery. A state able to centralize military loyalty acquires a terrifying resilience. It can survive succession struggles more easily, impose policy with greater consistency, and continue expansion without surrendering strategy to every local magnate with armed followers. Yet the Ottoman rise was not smooth, and this is essential. Historical triumph becomes intellectually useless if retold as inevitability. Bayezid I, brilliant and formidable, drove Ottoman expansion with extraordinary speed. His conquests and pressure on Constantinople suggested a dynasty nearing unstoppable momentum. But power concentrated too rapidly can produce fragility. Bayezid overextended amid a changing Eurasian balance, and in AD 1402 at Ankara he was defeated by Timur. The empire nearly came apart. This single event destroys the lazy myth of destiny. The Ottomans entered dynastic civil war. Their enemies recovered space. Their legitimacy cracked. The question was no longer how high the Ottoman state would rise, but whether it would survive at all. Here the deeper strength of the Ottoman project became visible. Mehmed I and later Murad II did not simply reclaim lands. They rebuilt legitimacy after catastrophe. That distinction is critical. Lost territory can sometimes be recovered through force. Lost confidence requires something more difficult, the restoration of belief among elites, soldiers, subject populations, and foreign powers that the state still possesses a future. The Ottoman restoration after Ankara was one of the great recoveries in imperial history. It revealed that enough administrative memory, dynastic prestige, and strategic flexibility had already been built into the system to outlast disaster. An empire capable of surviving near collapse is often more dangerous afterward, because the illusion of invulnerability has been replaced by hard-earned institutional realism. By the time Mehmed II came to power, the Ottomans were no longer merely a successful frontier beylik. They were a mature strategic organism with a clear center of ambition. Mehmed II understood the problem before him with unusual clarity. As long as Constantinople remained unconquered, however diminished the Byzantine Empire had become, a profound anomaly endured at the heart of Ottoman geography. The city stood amid Ottoman territories as a surviving symbol of Roman sovereignty, a diplomatic rallying point for enemies, and a reminder that Ottoman power, however immense, had not yet converted military predominance into universal legitimacy. This was the central paradox of the 15th century Eastern Mediterranean. The Ottomans surrounded the greatest imperial symbol of the old order, but had not yet consumed it. Therefore, the conquest of Constantinople was not a mere prize. It was a strategic necessity and a civilizational claim. Mehmed II, impatient, disciplined, and intellectually audacious, prepared accordingly. The siege of AD 1453 was a masterpiece of concentration. He did not rely on one instrument of war when several could be fused. He isolated the city diplomatically and physically. He built Rumeli Hazari to choke movement on the Bosporus and tighten command over the straits. He brought massive artillery to challenge walls long judged nearly invincible. He coordinated naval and land forces to ensure that pressure would come from multiple axes. This is the mark of high strategy. Great rulers do not merely attack the enemy's strongest point. They redesign the entire problem so that old strengths lose their previous meaning. The Theodosian walls had defended Constantinople for centuries because they were embedded in a strategic ecosystem that once included imperial resources, maritime support, and wider political depth. By AD 1453 the walls remained, but the ecosystem had decayed. Stone can endure longer than state capacity. The famous transport of Ottoman ships over land into the Golden Horn is often retold as theatrical ingenuity, but its deeper significance lies elsewhere. It was a psychological declaration that inherited rules would not be allowed to preserve Byzantine survival. If conventional naval access was blocked, unconventional movement would replace it. Mehmed signaled to defenders and observers alike that the siege would not be governed by precedent. Once an enemy proves willing to redefine the battlefield itself, traditional confidence begins to crumble. Yet romantic simplification would do injustice to the defenders. Constantinople still possessed extraordinary symbolic force, formidable fortifications, and leaders determined to resist. But courage does not manufacture reserves. Heroism does not refill the treasury. Prestige does not replace demographic depth. The Byzantine predicament was tragic precisely because the city remained grander in meaning than in means. It could still inspire devotion, but it could no longer command the scale of resources required to defeat the Ottoman state surrounding it. The wider Christian world, as so often before, responded with sympathy more readily than with coherent rescue. Therefore, the city entered its final struggle carrying the weight of a millennium with only a fraction of a millennium's power. When the final assault came and Constantinople fell on May 29 AD 1453, the event reverberated far beyond the walls. Byzantium did not merely lose a capital. The old Roman imperial continuity in the east ended. A dynasty that had begun on the frontier now acquired the most resonant imperial city in the region. The Ottomans gained not only territory, but a capital worthy of universal ambition, a strategic nexus of the Straits, and a legitimacy that transformed diplomacy from Venice to Moscow. This is why the fall of Constantinople cannot be reduced to siegecraft alone. It was the fusion of military success, geographic command, symbolic appropriation, and administrative readiness. A lesser state might have captured the city and failed to digest its meaning. The Ottomans made it the axis of an imperial system. The conquest converted momentum into destiny. After AD 1453, the psychological horizon changed. Ottoman expansion could now be imagined not as opportunistic growth, but as world-ordering supremacy. Serbia, Bosnia, the Black Sea Sphere, and eastern Anatolia were not isolated episodes. They became chapters in a larger imperial synthesis radiating from a transformed capital. The same dynamic extended under later rulers. Selim I's victory at Calderon in AD 1514 checked a dangerous eastern rival, the Safavids, and demonstrated the empire's capacity to fight not only fragmented principalities but major ideological and military challengers. Then the campaigns against the Mamluks in AD 1516 to AD 1517 carried Ottoman rule into Syria and Egypt. This changed everything. The empire was no longer merely the master of the Balkans and Anatolia. It now commanded Arab heartlands, key trade routes, and custodianship tied to Islam's holy cities. The Ottoman state had moved from regional hegemon to transcontinental superstate. Under Suleiman I, victory at Mohacs in AD 1526 confirmed Ottoman power as a continental fact that no European observer could honestly dismiss. Hungary was shattered as an independent great kingdom. Central Europe now felt directly the strategic consequences of decisions made on the Anatolian frontier generations earlier. Such outcomes reveal the true scale of the Ottoman achievement. They won the age not because they were the oldest civilization in the contest, nor because they inherited the greatest prestige, nor because every ruler was a genius. They won because, more consistently than their rivals, they aligned military energy, political legitimacy, administrative intelligence, and timing. That formula is merciless. History rarely rewards sentiment. It rewards systems that can mobilize force, extract revenue, integrate elites, and adapt under pressure. The Ottomans repeatedly demonstrated this combination. They understood that conquest without incorporation collapses. Therefore, they paired battlefield success with taxation, legal order, elite management, provincial negotiation, naval infrastructure, siege engineering, and ideological narrative. They built not merely an army, but a governing machine. Rivals often failed at precisely this point. Byzantium retained immense civilizational memory, but memory could not compensate for depleted capacity. Balkan powers fought bravely, but often too separately. The Mamluks possessed military tradition, but their structures proved less adaptable to changing strategic realities. Latin Christendom recognized the Ottoman challenge episodically, but not systemically. The result was that the Ottomans encountered opponents strong enough to resist individually, yet divided enough to lose collectively. This is one of history's harshest lessons: fragmentation is often conquered before territory is. Once elites cease to act as parts of a common strategic whole, an organized outsider can defeat them piecemeal while appearing merely opportunistic. The outsider seems unstoppable only because the insiders never truly become a coordinated system of resistance. Another lesson emerges from the frontier itself. Established civilizations often underestimate border societies. They mistake rough origins for permanent inferiority. But frontiers produce unusual political innovators precisely because they are shaped by danger, improvisation, and competition. A state born under pressure must learn quickly or die quickly. Therefore, when such a state survives and institutionalizes its lessons, it can become more formidable than older powers burdened by ceremony, complacency, or aristocratic inertia. The Ottoman rise is perhaps one of the clearest examples of this pattern in world history. A frontier polity learned to think like an empire before some empires remembered how to defend themselves like states. The cost, however, must not be hidden behind admiration for strategic brilliance. The fall of Constantinople ended one of history's greatest imperial continuities. Entire ruling traditions were extinguished or subordinated. Regions were reordered by conquest, extraction, and military necessity. Peoples were recruited, displaced, taxed, and governed according to the needs of a relentlessly expanding imperial center. Great state formation is rarely humane in any pure sense. It creates order, but often through compulsion. It stabilizes, but by first breaking inherited balances. It offers integration, but usually under terms set by the victor. Therefore, the Ottoman triumph should be understood neither as simple civilizational glory nor as mere catastrophe. It was a restructuring of power on a colossal scale, achieved by a dynasty that proved more disciplined, more adaptive, and more institutionally intelligent than its competitors. The verdict is clear. The Ottomans won the age because they mastered the conversion of disorder into durable rule. They seized the opportunities created by Byzantine fragmentation after AD 1204, by Mongol disruption after AD 1243, by Balkan rivalry, and by the repeated inability of rival powers to subordinate local feuds to strategic necessity. They understood that prestige without capacity is a mask, that victory without administration evaporates, and that legitimacy can be built as well as inherited. Constantinople fell because the empire defending it represented a magnificent past without equivalent present power, while the empire besieging it represented a dangerous future already learning how to govern. The modern mirror is uncomfortable. Societies still confuse memory with strength. States still imagine that fame, moral inheritance, or old institutional prestige can substitute for logistical competence, political unity, and adaptive strategy. Elites still fracture over local advantage while larger systemic threats accumulate. The Ottoman story warns that decline rarely arrives as a single dramatic blow. More often, decline is the long separation of symbol from substance. By the time the final breach appears, the decisive failures have already occurred in finance, recruitment, legitimacy, and strategic imagination. It also offers a second warning: powers from the margins should never be dismissed merely because they begin without refinement in the eyes of established centers. The most transformative states are often those forged in contested zones, where survival punishes rigidity and rewards invention. Geography offers opportunities, but only disciplined institutions can cash them in. The legacy question remains, and it is not one answered by chronology alone. When a civilization invokes its greatness, what exactly is it defending, living capacity, or the memory of former power? That is the riddle beneath the fall of Constantinople, and beneath so many collapses since. For history does not spare the cultured, the ancient, or the admired. It spares, for a time, the coherent.